So today I'm going to speak about Surrealist art. I'm still taking quite a narrow focus on the canon, the traditional Surrealist canon. So we'll be speaking quite a lot about Salvador Dali and some of the other white male Surrealists that were part of Breton's circle. And as we move on in the course, we can question this canon. And of course, we'll be looking at other Surrealists from other regions. But at the moment, we're taking quite a narrow focus. In this lecture today, I'll begin by looking at the styles and techniques that the artist used, or at least some of them. I'll be speaking about automatism, frottage, decalcomania, collaborative work, and collage paintings. I'll then speak about Salvador Dali's paranoid critical method, and we'll look at the way he had this method inspired by the psychology of delusions to create double images in his paintings. And we'll speak about that a little bit in the seminar. It's related to his text, The Rotting Donkey. And then I'll speak some more about the historical influences on Surrealist art and artists. We have already covered that in our first few lectures, thinking about the way Surrealism emerged from the horrors in the aftermath of World War I. And we've also spoken about the avant-garde in the 1920s and the Breton's first Surrealist manifesto in 1924. So today, in terms of the historical context, I'll speak a little bit more about the Spanish Civil War, and we're moving on through the 20th century to start to see the influence that would come with the rise of Nazism in the lead up to the Second World War. So it caused these wars caused a lot of artists to go into exile, so I'll speak a little bit about that as well. So let's begin with a little bit of a look at some Surrealist styles and techniques. So the first one I'm going to speak about is frottage, and I'm sure children had been doing this forever, but Max Ernst developed this technique, and you probably all did it when you were children. You can put like a piece of paper over a piece of bark on a tree and rub it with a crayon to get some kind of pattern, or you can put it over other interesting objects and rub the interesting objects, and that creates a pattern. And frottage is the French word for rubbing. And Ernst used this to explore his feelings, and he was quite acquainted with a forest in his childhood, so no doubt he went out in his childhood and explored the bark on the trees. So automatic painting wasn't quite as successful as automatic drawing. The nature of the medium of oil didn't really lend itself to this. So Ernst also developed a technique called grattage, which was laying a canvas prepared with a layer of oil paint over a textured object, and then scraping the paint off to create a pattern or an interesting and unexpected surface. Decalcomania, which is now quite often called decal, was the spreading of gouache, oil or ink onto a smooth surface and then pressing paper onto it. And once the paper was peeled away, it left interesting patterns and textures. So as you can see, a lot of these painterly techniques are not about capturing an image faithfully, but rather about exploring random ways of creating interesting images. Another thing that the artists did was play the same game as the writers, the exquisite caliver game that we've spoken about. And the name, of course, came from the written results, where they had passed a piece of paper around, and the story was emerged, the exquisite corpse will drink the new wine. So this became the name of the game, and each person would draw something. So this is an example in the slide here of one of the outcomes of one of these games. they were really interested in words and text and art together. So there are a lot of works which bring together text and image. And Miro is particularly known for this. And this is also one of, as I've mentioned before, one of the features of Surrealism, this exploration of the poetics of text and image. So in this slide, a star caresses the breasts of a Negro woman. You have Miro's exploration of visual poetics and also him playing with the shape of words. So you can see the French word for star in the top of the painting, and also the word slightly further down you see the word negress. So the idea is that the star suggests there's a star in the sky, but it's also playing with the beauty of the words. It has been suggested that the word negress links with the abstract triangular shapes beside it to suggest that they are representing the female figure. I find this quite problematic, and conceptually I find the image problematic. I think it really reveals the surrealist interest in the exotic and the other, and we can speak about that a little bit more when we're thinking about the gendered aspects of surrealism. Perhaps next week we'll speak a bit more about that. So the meaning of this, of course, is ambiguous. Some people have suggested that that was the meaning, but like most of the surrealist works, there's no fixed meaning. And this work was actually built round the first line of an erotic poem. And the two triangles can be seen to represent a woman in Miro's language of signs. So he's developing his own poetics in this. And we could say that his style has similarities with collage, where you paste different fragments of paper representing different things together. In fact, it was actually Max Ernst that brought the idea of collage paintings into the Surrealist group. He had created collages and he showed them to the other Surrealists, and they were fascinated with them. If we think about collages, which are very ubiquitous now, if we think about the way, for example, when you cut things out of a magazine to put on a collage, you're taking it out of its original context and putting it in a new context. And as we said last week, this was one of the things that the Surrealists like to do. They like to take ordinary quotidian things and take them out of their original functional environment and put them in new environments. So collage was ideal for this. That's exactly what was happening in collage. And Ernst thought that collage was similar to frottage, as it unlocked the irrational. So what you find in collages are lots of juxtapositions, and of course we've spoken already about the way juxtapositions are also strongly used in Surrealism. Breton wrote the preface to Ernst's 1921 Paris exhibition, and he wrote about poetry and collage, considering the way the combinations might reveal unconscious secrets and desires. It is the marvellous faculty of attaining two widely separate realities without departing from the realm of our experience, of bringing them together and drawing a spark from their contact. End of quote. So in this one, Pietà by Night, we've got a rather metafictional painting that really refers to itself. It certainly references the art historical tradition to do Pietà paintings. So these were art historical images of the dead Christ in Mary's arms. The word pietà means pity in Italian. And so Ernst is making an intertextual reference to these images. He's using the composition of these pietà paintings, but of course there's a great parody in this, because what we have here, rather than having Christ in Mary's arms, we have perhaps the artist himself in his father's arms. certainly has a man in man's arms. We see the recurring motif of the bowler hat here, and perhaps this could be read in Freudian ways. Certainly Bradley has read this in terms of the Freudian Oedipus complex. The bowler hat is a recurring motif in Surrealist art, so we have lots of these motifs that recur throughout. The eye we looked at last week, the bowler hat is another. There are lots of little symbols that come to be, they form a sort of pictorial syntax in a way, visual iconography that departs greatly from religious iconography. So Ernst read Freud's texts, the interpretation of dreams and jokes and their relation to the unconscious. So it's very likely that he had these in mind when he was creating paintings like this. This is also an oniric painting. We've spoken about the oniric and the surrealist obsession with dream images, and this Pietà, or Revolution by Night, is an example of this. So perhaps the artist that we most associate with dream imagery in the run-up to the Surrealist movement is Giorgio de Chirico, who inspired the Surrealists with his oniric paintings. Of course, we now know that the most famous dream images were created by Salvador Dali, and we'll look at them in a minute. But let's think about de Chirico's work, because it was certainly an inspiration for the Surrealists. He used familiar objects in unfamiliar contexts, and he had uneasy juxtapositions in his work. So just as we would go on to see the Surrealists have these uneasy, uncanny juxtapositions. And he was welcomed into the movement, but they didn't like his later work. And so it really was Salvador Dali that came to be known as the artist who created the most famous dream images. This painting, or image of Salvador Dali's painting Metamorphosis of Narcissus, is based on the Freudian myth. Freud had used the myth of Narcissus to explain the stage of psychological development in the individual that comes before the Oedipus complex. So this is a theory about the child's subconscious desire for the opposite sex parent and the hatred for the same sex parent. So the Greek myth of Narcissus loved himself, and the word narcissistic has come to refer to someone who's overly obsessed with themselves. In the myth, he saw his own reflection in the water and he fell in love with his reflection, and he discovered that he could not touch or embrace this reflection, and that led him to die of frustration. And so the gods turned him into a daffodil, and we see, so a daffodil is, in some European languages, the narcissus flower, in German for example. And so we see the narcissus flower emerging from the egg. So Narcissus is turned into the image of a hand in the painting, and it holds an egg, and emerging from the egg is a flower which must be emerging from a narcissus bulb inside the egg. Now in this painting you can also see like the double imagery. You have what appears at first to be rocks, and then it could also be a human figure, and then of course it could also be a hand. And this double image has become the hallmark of Dali's work, and it stems from his interest in mental health, as I'll explain in a minute. It stems from his interest in delusions and hallucinations. So in your essays, an essay exploring this could compare, for example, Dali's interest in mental health with Carrington's representation of dementia. And Dali called the style hand-painted photography. He painted it, the composition, with his method, the paranoid critical method. In terms of this painting, Dali took this painting with him when he went to see Freud in 1938, and he wrote a poem to accompany the painting which mentions his wife Gala and links her to himself. And it is, when that head splits, when that head splits, when that head bursts, it will be the flower, the new Narcissus, Gala, my Narcissus. So there's also a reflection on his own wife in the painting. So if you're interested in Dali's poetry, you could also think about comparing visual and verbal. For example, comparing Dali's visual and verbal output. We're looking this week at his text, The Rotting Donkey, so you could compare the text with some of his paintings, and you could also compare the visual and verbal output of Leonora Carrington. We're going to look at her paintings next week, and also her novel, The Hearing Trumpet. So hopefully you're all reading and enjoying The Hearing Trumpet already. So Dali developed a lot of theory, and one of his theories helped to bridge the dichotomy between individualistic and socially engaged art that we spoke about last week. So this dichotomy between the Surrealist emphasis on the individual mind, but their aspirations to have revolutionary art that transforms society. So Dali's paranoid critical method attempted to bridge this dichotomy between individualistic and socially engaged art. So if you remember, we spoke about the fact that in the 1930s the Surrealists wanted to work out how they could move to a more utopian state. And this method was really attempting to provide some answer to that question, how they could do that. So if you remember, they started working with the French Communist Party to find a way that Surrealism could contribute to the transformation of man. But as we've said already, it became apparent that the two are opposites in many ways. Surrealism is about the individual exploring their consciousness, whereas communism and socially engaged art is about the collective. So this creates a tension, and some figures from Surrealism abandon it, like Louis Aragon. Most of the group were committed to this political goal, but Dali not quite so much. And later, there was an ambivalence in Dali, and later when he was living in the United States, he would get called Avida Dollars because of the way he sought fame and fortune, and he became very wealthy. But actually his work was very technically accomplished, and so we can consider whether or not it is problematic that he took on commercial projects. Anyway, one of Dali's contributions to the question of whether Surrealist art could be socially and politically engaged was his paranoid critical method. And it was inspired by the way paranoid people can misinterpret things or interpret visual information incorrectly to see things. So I think he's talking here about delusions specifically, and visual delusions in particular. So by 1930 he had invented this paranoid critical thought process, and by 1932 it was called the paranoid critical method. His grandfather had suffered delusions and committed suicide. So Dali was fascinated by these delusions and by Freud's work, and Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. He had linked paranoia to repression, and the paranoid critical method was based on the way paranoid people misinterpret things or interpret visual information incorrectly. So they may have visual hallucinations, in which case they might see something and think it is something completely different. And Dali was interested in research by Freud and Lacan into the paranoid condition, and also into the way that paranoid people can see the same things repeatedly in different places as they project their mental images onto their surroundings. So unlike automatism, in which the individual takes no conscious control, here the artist is using the paranoid critical method to shape the image, but he is trying to replicate mental processes. And Dali said that this was to systematize confusion and contribute to a total discrediting of the world of reality. So to show that actually there are subjective realities. So it was nothing to do with curing the illness of paranoia or treating people for trauma that might have induced the paranoia, but rather it was undermining the conditioned perceptions of reality. So undermining this notion that we have that the world as we experience it is fixed, by showing that different people can see different things in the same place, in different situations, depending on their state of mind. So it's based on the idea that any visual image is open to multiple interpretations. And Dali wrote, "It is by a distinctly paranoid process that it has been possible to obtain a double image, in other words, a representation of an object that is also, without the slightest pictorial or anatomical modification, the representation of another entirely different object." And we can think about that we can discuss the text in our seminar. But I think what he's talking about here is the person who can see one thing, so they might go to the beach and see a pile of rocks. But if they're traumatized, or if they have some illness of paranoia, they might have a visual hallucination, and that the rocks might actually appear to them to be a person, or the rocks might appear to them to be a hand. So this is the idea that if the artist can stimulate this, that he can stimulate paranoia, or he or she can stimulate paranoia, that anyone can demonstrate that reality is subjective rather than fixed, and to therefore demonstrate that it's a social construct. So the idea is to demonstrate that there are multiple accounts, multiple perceptions or representations of reality. So Dali is showing that mental illness can demonstrate that reality is a social construct, a social and psychic construction. And this is something that emerges in the hearing trumpet as well. So as you're reading the book, you might like to reflect on that and reflect on the mental health issues that are raised by the hearing trumpet. And in one of your essays, you might like to reflect on the subjective realities in the hearing trumpet and Dali's work. So that could be interesting, that either the link on these different realities or the links with mental health. So the paranoid critical method deconstructs the symbolic realm in order to deconstruct social reality. So it provided a methodology for an attack on bourgeois society in the staunchly confined society, that with this sense of things are as they're known. So Dali explained this a bit further in his text, The Rotten Donkey, and that's the text that you're hopefully reading this week. It's very short, but we can discuss that in the seminar. And it might also be useful for writing about Un Chien Andalou as well, because of course, as you will recall, there were rotting donkeys on the pianos. So these are a recurring motif for Dali. Essentially, though, the concept is that by stimulating paranoia, anyone can demonstrate that reality is subjective, and by extension, that it's a social construct. So even if this is perhaps a step too far, we can see that on at least a basic level, he used this inspiration to create rather hallucinogenic paintings in which you have double images, where the image is one thing, but it can also be another object as well. In the paintings, they take on different forms. The rocks, for example, are also a hand, and they're also a human form. So you might also be interested in Dali's interest in Lacan, who of course was also writing for the Surrealist magazines. The link between Dali's theory and Lacan's theories is discussed briefly but quite clearly in the book Surrealism and the Spanish Civil War, which is one of the best books on Spanish surrealism. Dali's paintings can also be seen to relate to trauma. I haven't gone into too many biographical details because there is a danger that if you root your analysis too closely in biographical details, it could sink what would otherwise be a really good essay. But if you're interested in this, the images of his enraged father might make a good starting point. And these could also be linked to the Freudian Oedipus complex. But be careful, I think, when you start to look at these biographical links between the paintings and the artists, and that's particularly the case with women artists, where there's always a disproportionate focus on their biography. So Breton thought the paranoid critical method was a useful contribution to surrealism. So now I'd like to speak about some more of the historical and political influences on surrealist art. I'll begin with the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War ran from 1936 to 1939, and it was a war in which right-wing nationalists attempted to overthrow the Spanish government, in a military coup, and then they sought to take over the country in a civil war. So the nationalists were supported by Nazi Germany and Italy when they tried to overthrow the government. However, Republicans loyal to the left-leaning Spanish government, in alliance with anarchists and communists, fought against the nationalists. Some might say fascists. The Republicans received aid from the Soviet Union, the USA and Europe, and international brigades arrived from everywhere. I think they went from Scotland, England. They basically went from all over Europe to support the left-wing cause. The nationalists were a Falangist, Carlist, Catholic, and largely aristocratic group led by General Francisco Franco, and they ultimately won in the end. There was a gap between those artists at the time who believed in active political engagement and those who believed that surrealist activity should be an autonomous activity and not linked to these political struggles. So in the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War and the spectre of Nazism, which is approaching, if you think this is just the decade before in the run-up to the Second World War. So you've got Nazism raising its head, and these things were starting to affect art. There's a conflict between intellectual artistic freedom and the idea that art should have revolutionary or political principles. So, in terms of the Spanish Civil War, in 1931, the Republican government replaced the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, and the French Surrealists supported this. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War officially began, but tensions had been rising in the years prior to this. French Surrealists issued a statement about it, using the French government to support the Republicans, but the French government, while offering the statement, they refused to take in refugees and they stopped resources and they declared neutrality. So Dali escaped Barcelona for France. And a few months before the outbreak of civil war, when the tensions between the left and right were escalating, Dali painted this painting that you see on the slide, this image of a painting that you see on the slide, soft construction with boiled beans, premonition of civil war. So it's grotesque, and what you see is a body tearing itself apart. It's monstrous. There's something of Goya in this painting. If you recall the Spanish painter Goya, you might have looked at the video about Spanish painting that's on Keats and be familiar with Goya's work. So there's something of self-destruction in this. And it's also the Spanish landscape. So here what you have is the Spanish landscape tearing itself apart. It's barbaric. And this one, Autumnal Cannibalism, is also barbaric. Again, you have it rooted in the Spanish landscape, the colours of the Spanish landscape, but something grotesque. You have something quite barbaric and nightmarish. Here you see a person emerging from a chest of drawers, and they're eating, but they don't seem to have a face or a mouth. So it's completely surreal, and it takes something bourgeois. So you have the shirt, the white shirt, and the knives and forks, or the fork and spoon of a fine dining experience, but it turns it into something more nightmarish. And this table is in a typical Catalonian landscape that Dali was so familiar with, and which is also another signature of his style, this Spanish landscape, in so many of his paintings. We have the recurring motifs of dismembered bodies, and also a chest of drawers, which links to some of Freud's writings, which said that the mind was like a chest of drawers. We've also got the crutch and the apple and the ants found, which we find in other paintings as well. So he's again starting to develop these recurring motifs. It's oniric, it has a dreamlike quality, and things merge into one another. So in many ways, we have a pictorial representation of some of the fades that we saw in Un Chat and de Loup, where we looked at the different styles of montage. We looked at the way some shots faded and became other things. And you see this represented visually in this painting, with the hands fading into the chest of drawers and cloth fading into the drawer and human forms fading into the hands. So it's quite Freudian. Dali was obsessed with figures of speech, which Freud said were related to the unconscious. So if you think back, I mean, we've moved so far beyond Freud now, it's difficult really to really think of these with any kind of, scientific firmness. But if we think about things like slips of the tongue and Freud's interest in the things that people said and how speech was related to the unconscious. So here we have also a literal take on the term chest of drawers. It's literally a chest with drawers in it. So we do have images here that are reflecting the destruction that is going on in Spain, but Dali wasn't always a socially committed artist. He is representing the situation in some ways, or the violence in some ways, but he also created at the same time crazy items like his lobster telephone. So there's some ambivalence in his work regarding politics. So this lobster telephone is the surrealist object par excellence. It's just absurd and crazy, and here we have the lobster, which might make the same noise as a telephone or a similar noise in it, but it's got pincers. So of course the handset of a telephone you would normally put to your ear, but you're not going to want to put anything that might pinch you, that might nip you to your ear. So there's something a little bit disturbing about the lobster, something quite threatening about the lobster that might come so close to your face. So surrealism is all about taking the domestic, the quotidian, the prosaic, and making it strange. And this is exactly what Dali does with this lobster telephone. We really see this in the lobster telephone. So this is what you might call uncanny. And this term was first used by the German psychiatrist Ernst Jenst in his essay on the psychology of the uncanny in 1906. And then Sigmund Freud went on to define it in his 1919 essay, The Uncanny. And he gives a sense of the uncanny as familiar yet alien, hidden, repressed, or frightening. And I think we have these things in the lobster telephone. It's familiar, the telephone is familiar, the lobster is familiar, but it's alien to put these two things together. And there's something, it feels like there's something frightening about this. So the artist created artworks that combined familiar things in an unexpected way to create these uncanny feelings. And Dali wrote a lot of theory about surrealist objects. It's fairly obscure, but it did formalise the practice. And perhaps the most famous surrealist object is Merit Oppenheim's object, her fur teacup, which she commented on when she was in like having lunch with Picasso, that it would be funny to come. I think Picasso maybe commented on fur that she was wearing and that it could cover anything, and then she said, oh, you could cover this cup and saucer with it, and that's where the idea came from. And it has become the most famous surrealist object. So they were also fascinated by the idea of the fetish, in which in some cultures are objects that are worshipped or considered to have magical powers. In other cultures, the fetish is on the cusp between the dream world and the psychological realm. So either has some kind of magical significance or some kind of erotic significance. And the surrealists were fascinated by ceremonial objects brought back by European romanticisms. So they have this interest in the other. Now they were in favour of decolonization, but there is something problematic as well in their interest in the other, certainly in some of the original European white males' appropriation of motifs from other cultures. Not all of them though, because if we think about some of the surrealists who weren't born in Europe, so Wilfrido Lam was born in Cuba and came on to be one of the original surrealist group. He went to Spain to study in the 20s, and then he also went to France where he met Picasso and the other surrealists. Oh, I say Picasso and the other surrealists, so I think Picasso wasn't considered or he didn't want to be part of the Breton's group of surrealists, but I'm not defining surrealists in the same way that Breton did, as whether he accepted them or rejected them, defining them in terms of the characteristics of their art. Anyway, to go back to Wilfrido Lam, at the start of the Spanish Civil War, he made posters and propaganda for the Republicans, the left-wing groups that were fighting against the nationalist groups that were aligned with the Nazis. And so we can contrast his work for sort of against the fascists with Dali's ambivalent lobster telephone. So in an essay you might like to look at the broader relationship that some of these surrealists have with colonial history. And as you go on to look at the Tate collection, you might want to think about decolonising surrealism and decolonising some of these original conceptions of surrealists. Certainly there were other surrealist groups in Algeria, and we'll look at some of the Latin American ones next week, and in Africa we'll look at Afro-surrealism later in this module. But in your essay you might like to reflect on the relationship that the surrealists had with colonial history. So if we think again about Wilfredo Lam's work, it combined radically modern style with traditional South American iconography. So you've got these Afro-Cuban shapes, these hybrid figures that were half person, half vegetation. And this is something that we'll see again, this hybridity. We'll see this again in Leonora Carrington's art next week. And it was also something that you found in other Latin American surrealist work. I think you could say that there's something of the hybrids in Roberto Mata's work. So Lam combined this radically modern style with the traditional Afro, of course, which was also modern, but some of the traditional or long-standing iconography of African-inspired Cuban art. After World War II, so we're jumping forward a little bit, he worked with Breton and the Surrealists and illustrated one of Breton's poems. And he had been imprisoned in 1941, but he was released after 40 days. So he went back to Cuba, and that's where he created this work, The Jungle, which fused surrealist and cubist approaches with his real interest in Cuban vegetation and the Santeria religion, which they have in sort of a spirituality that they have in Cuba. Again, we have these part animal, part Cuban, part vegetable figures that were to be the hallmark of his work. And we have mask-like heads that remind us of African rituals. So it's definitely influenced by African pottery and also anti-colonial. So in 1960, Breton signed the Manifesto of 121 in support of independence for Algeria. So certainly we have a real anti-colonial decolonizing drive in the work of some of the artists at the time. Other artist responses to the Spanish Civil War: Miró declared a war on painting, wanted to dismantle bourgeois structures and change the language used to articulate the world. And he wanted to reduce painting to the most elemental. So he created a dematerialized realm, a cusp of metaphor and abstraction, which you can see in this still life with old shoe painting. And he explored the way national identity could remain intact while society degenerated into war. He also used gendered visual syntax and the motif of the Catalan peasant. And as things got worse in Catalonia, so we see this played out a little bit in Miró's work. I guess the most famous war painting of the time is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which used the bullfight to explore humanity's engagement with the spectacle of violence. So Guernica was bombed by the Germans in a practice bombing. Okay, so we also have Salvador Dali's Mountain Lake. So I've spoken about the growing spectre of fascism that was emerging following the Spanish Civil War, or I guess in parallel to it. 1937 saw the occupation of France by Germany in World War II. So a lot of Surrealists had to go into exile because Nazism was fascist and the left-wing Surrealists were considered subversive. As I've mentioned, Salvador Dali was on the fence. He refused to denounce fascism. Here we have this painting, Mountain Lake, which was part of a series of paintings inspired by phone calls between the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler. Chamberlain adopted a strategy of appeasement with Hitler, but was only involved in the first 8 months of the war. And Dali was fascinated by Hitler. The Surrealists, and particularly Breton, didn't like this. And Dali also created this painting, The Enigma of Hitler, which enraged the other Surrealists, and he was expelled from Breton's group. Then Dali went to New York, but he became extremely successful, taking on commercial opportunities to paint, for example, to paint wealthy people. And there were lots of lucrative commissions painting the New York elite, and he became known as Avida Dollars. So World War II affected a number of other Surrealists. Max Ernst was imprisoned in France as an undesirable foreigner, and then he was released. And after the German occupation, Ernst was captured by the Gestapo, and Peggy Guggenheim managed to get him out and help him to get to New York. So Ernst was the lover of Leonora Carrington at the time, whose novel The Hearing Trumpet we're going to look at next week, and also whose art we're going to look at next week. And Carrington was also forced to flee from her home in France to Spain, and then she went on to Mexico. And in the process, she had a mental breakdown, which is captured in the novel Down Below. But we're looking at her novel The Hearing Trumpet, which has serious messages, but it's also joyful and humorous and full of humour. So we'll speak about that next week. So the Surrealists presented themselves as anti-colonial, but then the Spanish Civil War and World War II preoccupied them. In 1960, Breton signed the Manifesto of 121 in support of the people of Algeria in arms against the French government. But another major contradiction was their enthusiasm for ceremonial objects and their construction of a mythic conception of Africa and of the Americas, which we can reflect on more in the next few weeks. So they were quite interested in exoticism, and some people have argued that Leonora Carrington, living in Mexico, had a real understanding of non-European cultures, unlike Breton. She visited Chiapas, and so you find Mayan cosmology influencing her work. So we're going to look at this a little bit more next week. I will finish there. Thank you.